NVIDIA is giving you the least amount of CUDA cores for a given class of GPU than ever before. Today, an RTX 5070 is comparable to a GTX 950 in some ways when we ran the numbers. An RTX 5080 isn't distant from a 2060 in some considerations. The relationship between the number of CUDA cores the flagship has and the number that the lower tier GPUs have has been getting worse basically across the board. The amount of money you have to spend, even inflation adjusted, to buy GPUs has been staying flat or rising. So you're getting less stuff repackaged, but spending at least the same money, which kind of feels like the buzzwordy shrinkflation, except applied directly to the GPU side of the industry. We've already talked about the pricing issues, availability, all that stuff, but what we're doing now is revisiting a topic that we ran about maybe 2 years ago called the RTX 4080 problem. And in that video, we explored why at the time, no one was buying 4080s. They couldn't get rid of them fast enough. It wasn't just because of the money, it was because of the relationship of what you got for the money. And we're taking those same concepts where we broke out the pricing, the components, the die area, all that stuff, and applying it to the 50 series, and it has not gotten better. So let's get into it. Before that, this video is brought to you by ID Cooling and the frozen A720 cooler. The A720 air cooler performed well in our testing last year. The A720 is a relatively high-end, dual 140mm air cooler with 7 heat pipes. We found the use of larger fans can be beneficial to acoustic performance given the thermals, although you'll want to check your case for compatibility given the taller nature of the cooler and its fans. ID Cooling uses an all-black look for its A720 and includes mounting hardware for all modern sockets. Learn more at the link in the description below. So we're going to keep this one really short and focused today. We've just got 2 main charts to go through, but they're really interesting to think about, a lot of data points on them. And now that NVIDIA has shipped everything except for the 60 class, we've got a good amount to look at. And so really the goal of this is to just kind of explore the relationship between the money and what you get for it. That's the key focus. But we're also going to compare some of the cards against prior generations and doing some inflation adjustments. So should be interesting. We started to work on this piece for the 5080 launch and then realized, wait a minute, it's gonna get worse. And so we waited for the 5070 and it's here. Unfortunately, but it is here. So let's get into the data for this. This chart compares the percentage of the flagship CUDA core count that each configuration is. Due to the architectural changes, we're not interested in the raw count of CUDA cores, but the percentage of occupancy of the maximum config for the flagship die. This line plot tracks each same-named GPU class across NVIDIA generations on a percentage scale representing how many CUDA cores each has relative to a larger configuration. The GPUs are all shown relative to the CUDA core count of that generation's top gaming non-Titan GPU. The 5090, 4090, 2080 Ti, 1080 Ti, and so on. We're calling these the flagship class. If you see 100% anywhere, that means it's equal in CUDA core count to the flagship. We went with the 3090 for the 30 series rather than the late arriving cash grab full die 3090 Ti. We had to make a judgment call. The flagship class is plotted relative to the largest die's maximum possible core count. The GTX 780 Ti is one of the few exceptions where NVIDIA made a flagship with the full non-cut down die here. The GTX 780 had 80% of the CUDA cores that the flagship 780 Ti did. The 2080 brought that down to 68% of full CUDA count, then just 59% for the 4080, but it gets worse. The 5080 is a mockery of an 80 class card with only 49% of the flagship class CUDA count configuration. We don't care if the die is different or not for this chart, just the config. The 3080 temporarily bucked that trend at 83%, which was awesome. This correlates with its incredibly good value and performance at launch that was met with positive reviews, like this. The card performance overall is impressive. It's a big recovery from the 20 series when we reviewed it and called like 3 of the cards a waste of our time because they were basically 1080 Ti's, and then complained piteously for 55 days about how there was no RTX and the cards were named RTX. So this is a big turnaround for NVIDIA. However, that also contrasts with the review we and others gave the 3090 and 3090 Ti. So for us, a hard pass on this. 8 to 12% for $2,200 is insane. And with an overclock back then, we were able to nearly equate the 3090's performance with an OC 3080. That's how close they were. The odd 80 Ti and Super class from the 20 series to the 40 series occupy the space between the 80 class and the flagships. There'll likely be another one between the 5080 and 5090. It's such a wide gulf. And that's why we think the Super series should really be rebranded to the Oopsies series, as in the RTX 5080 oopsies. They roll out the Super Series every time NVIDIA makes an oopsies on the price and or likely combine the public sentiment. And using supers to meet halfway on the price seems to be the trend here. Our hope is that the 5080 and 5090 gap ends up again as an oops, let's fix this rally from NVIDIA. Ideally with a mix of the 2080 supers or 4080 supers, relative to the current situation, more sane pricing. This is part of the stutter stepping they're doing though. That's a different video. And in combination with the 3080 Ti's aggressive configuration, that might help start to fix this a little bit. The 70 Ti and Super class drops hard. The 1070 Ti had a 68% CUDA core configuration for this class, falling to just 41% for the 5070 Ti. By this logic, the 1070 Ti offered far more GPU relative to the 1080 Ti than the 5070 Ti did relative to the 5090. And join NVIDIA for its next magic trick, because now we are going to expose NVIDIA's grand switcheroo of the 70 and 80 class cards. From the 770 series to the 3070, the CUDA core count of the 70 class cards once reliably was between 53 to 59% of the flagship's CUDA core count. And the card falling into what was once the 70 class's 50 to 60% range, that was now the 4080. Moving into the present, the 5070 has an anemic 28% of the flagship's configuration. If you were to extend the 70 class line out on its previous trend, you'd arrive around the same position as where the 80 class is now. Strictly speaking in proportions, and if we want to do funny percent math, the 3070's core allocation relative to its respective flagship was 100% higher proportionally against the 5070s. Here's the 60 class. This is where it gets really bad. That 28% figure for the 5070 is lower than almost every 60 class configuration. The 60 class traditionally occupied the 30 to 40% range, with a high outlier in the 20 series at 44%. This tracks with the fact that we were softly positive on the 2060 at its release, more positive than the 2080. The 3060 returned to the low 30% range, but the 4060 got slashed to 19%. Here's what we said of the 4060's worst cousin, the 4060 Ti. The RTX 4060 Ti 8GB is one of the worst GPU launches from NVIDIA that we've ever covered. And that brings us to the 50 class. The 19% on the 4060 is where the 50 class has sat multiple times. NVIDIA covered this segment during the 20 series with its 16 series GPUs, which we didn't plot for sake of simplicity. Moving forward, the 3050 was a 24% configuration, and it's no wonder why the 4050 got canned. It'd be like scraping the bottom of the barrel so hard that you just get splinters. But what's crazy is that the 5070 barely clears the 27% config of the old GTX 950. That's just sad. And now that we've established the trends, let's keep all that in mind and analyze the pricing situation. Again. This line plot tracks the launch price of all the same GPUs in each class, adjusted for inflation from the month of each GPU's launch to January 2025. Right away, we see that the flagship class has changed massively. The 780 Ti, 980 Ti, and legendary 1080 Ti fall within a consistent $100 spread. The 980 Ti was slightly cheaper at a $650 launch price, which is $865 after the inflation adjustment. The 1080 Ti sits at $912, in stark contrast to the massive jump of the 2080 Ti at $1,510 adjusted. That's a 66% increase gen on gen to the customer. It was technically available for $1,000, but in very limited quantities, and the vast majority went for $1,200 at the time, which is what we adjusted from. The price went up again for the 3090, with a slight relief for the 4090, before jumping again to the $2,000 mark with the 5090. It undoubtedly costs more for NVIDIA to make a 5090 than it did to make a 1080 Ti. But there's no argument that more than double the retail price is painful for a consumer. The 80 class has also risen, though not to the same extreme degree as the flagship class. The GTX era 80s had inflation-adjusted prices between $734 and $886. There was a slight bump to just over $1,000 in the 20 series, followed by relief to the mid-800s at the 3080, before rising insurmountably to the 4080. When taken alongside the CUDA core configurations, all of this underscores just how good the 3080 was, and it was recognized for that when it launched, and how terrible the 4080 was. The 3080 had this huge spike in the core allocation and a return to sort of normal pricing. Now, all of this is until things went absolutely crazy a little bit after its launch, but that's not what we're looking at today, because it's It seems to just, that's like a normal now. It just always goes crazy. But the 4080, in opposition to this, fell off a core configuration cliff and the price went up. And coming back to the present, the 5080 has also increased in price, but the core config has continued to come down. The 80 Ti and Superclass remains an oddball, as if NVIDIA hasn't been able to decide whether it's better as a later, better value 80 class alternative, like in the 20 and 40 series, or if it should be a weirdly positioned poor value cash grab like the 3080 Ti. The 70 Ti in Superclass has risen in price across the generations that it's existed, from roughly $500 at its introduction in the 10 series to $849 in the 40 series. AMD Radeon GPUs were competitive in this price bracket back in the 10 and 20 days, which is likely the reason why we see this aggressive pricing during that period. From the 30 series onward, NVIDIA's dominance has allowed this class of card specifically to sit comfortably between the 80 and 70 classes. The 70 class has managed to stay relatively flat from one end of the chart to the other. The all-time low price was in the GTX 900 series at $440, and we know how they did that. And the high point was the 20 series at about $750. That's a large swing, but it's stayed relatively flat since then. The 60 class paints a similar picture. The inflation-adjusted price line is generally flat overall with a slight downward trajectory since the 20 series. But in that same time, the core config has gone into the dumpster. And all this is without looking at the future 5060, but we bet it won't be a pleasant addition to this data set. Finally, the 50 class hasn't seen much action, but it hasn't seen many releases in recent years, probably because the 4060 took its actual place. Judging by the 3050, NVIDIA is probably unwilling to launch a GPU for under $250 again, let alone the $145 mark of the 1050, at least not counting something that's basically just a display card like a GT 1030. Another interesting thing to think about is that over the years it feels like product segmentation has changed. The means of executing it have shifted. So product segmentation on its own isn't inherently a bad thing. It can be used in sort of evil ways to segment things in more artificial and arbitrary ways than necessary. But in the world of silicon where everything's crazy expensive, it can cost hundreds of millions of dollars to design an architecture, $1 billion. I think of one old cited example from Jensen Huang. It costs all this money for years, and then you sell it, and you got to make money. It makes sense to try and parse that in a way where, okay, how can we make more money on some of this silicon to try and recoup that cost and make a little bit too? And so this is how you get Quadro cards and Titans and things like that, where with a Quadro card, part of what you might be paying for is a certain level of liability or exposure limitation, where it's like, okay, this is a professional class card. It's got these special certified drivers from NVIDIA, where if I run a simulation and that simulation spits out a wrong number, and because of that wrong number, someone dies, I have a base level of protection from that specific scenario. A gaming user probably isn't going to be in as much of a situation to worry about that. They're online killing people all day anyway. It's all the same to them. In CS2 or Quake or Unreal, people don't play those last two anymore. We should change that. Point is, if there ever was one, the means of product segmentation have shifted. And so something like a 1080 Ti, there's 11 gigabytes of memory, the Titan was 12. That was product segmentation. It was an intentional act done to shift down one SKU and make it less desirable to a specific group of users who needed 12 for what they were doing, and then sell the other product. Precision. They're back in the days when NVIDIA was starting to segment out double precision performance. That's another example. But in many of these situations, like the 11 gigabytes on the 1080 Ti, it just doesn't feel as bad to the consumer as what we're seeing today, where now it's segmenting the memory in a way where it can create these unusable situations. It's also segmenting out things like the CUDA core count where there is an observable performance impact. And so the 5090 suddenly becomes this sort of creator class card where you have this new emergent type of user where in addition to and joining the scientific users, the AI or ML users, you now have these so-called creators. That's not just YouTubers or people who do what we do. It's really, as the industry's defined it, anybody who makes stuff with their computer, and that might be art or whatever, videos, and out the end of that stuff you've made, you're trying to make money because it's your job or whatever. The trouble is the segmentation to try and start breaking all these groups into pieces to capitalize more on the groups that are using the product to make money, that is starting to bleed into the gaming user, where The type of user who wants a high-end card with a lot of VRAM, depending on where you cut off that VRAM line with NVIDIA, apparently for whatever reason, it's 16 gigabytes in a lot of cases, that user is now sharing space where it's a high-end enthusiast gaming build, or it's a professional who's willing to pay a lot of money because they don't have another option, and it's going to make their work go faster and their employees spend less time on it, and it saves them money and whatever. It's a lot different for that user than it is for someone playing games and building a gaming PC. And this is creating this sort of problem where NVIDIA is just trying to capitalize on all of it all at once. So for the gaming audience, we end up with situations like this, where a $750 video card can find itself in scenarios of unplayable stuttering, latency nearing like 800 milliseconds in the stupidest maliciously compliant example we could think of. And this is due to VRAM overload and swapping. So on one side, you've got NVIDIA using segmentation to push gamers up into a more expensive class of card, and yet that card is getting worse than it was last time comparatively to the one above that. And this is why people are so frustrated, in addition to all the other problems like the availability. And meanwhile, the users who are trying to make money off of the devices, they are now basically being sold to 5090. Whereas back in the 1080 Ti days, that was a much more narrow, like, okay, this is a sort of a gaming flagship product. And yes, of course, you can use it if you're using Adobe Premiere. But the market was a lot different. And the way NVIDIA has responded to it, we think, is part of what's causing this pain for the consumer and especially the enthusiast user base. So the short version, I guess, of that thinking out loud is the segmentation is now getting to a point where NVIDIA is previously was sort of taking a slice down the customer base, and it was saying this slice is scientific users, and they need double precision. They did another subdivision. This one is for Quadro users, and they need special certifications. And then this is all the gaming users. But now NVIDIA, it feels like, is sort of subdividing that gaming user group, plus adding in a sort of so-called creator group to that slice. And that's where it's getting diced so many ways now. It just feels like, and it's true, these charts support, you are getting less for spending more. It's really that simple. Back in our RTX 4080 problem video, we talked about how all of this is predicated on the assumption that names mean anything. And again, like whose line, sometimes it feels like the names are made up and the prices don't matter. But this is actually key. We've been really open about our opinions changing on this over the years, where at one point, I really did feel like the names were arbitrary, because to me, back then, it was like, well, look at the spec sheet, and you're judging the spec sheet, really, is what you're doing. And the name, whatever. They can name it anything they want. It's arbitrary. You pick it out of a hat. Who cares? Also, like, whose line? But what I've kind of come to realize, and we've talked about this in the past, but my opinion has changed to where the name is not just something that NVIDIA owns. It is something that the customer base and the consumers align their expectations to, and that NVIDIA leverages in its marketing to create these, okay, you buy the 80 class, because NVIDIA has used 80 class cards to establish an expectation in customers. And regardless of whether NVIDIA intends it to still be perceived as high-end, as opposed to some mid-range card, which it is now, the fact is that their consumers do perceive the name 5080 as intended to be high-end. And so this is sort of a death of the author situation. But then NVIDIA doesn't want to go name a $1,000 video card 5070. Because that creates new problems. NVIDIA has died as the author, and the consumer is in control over what these names mean to them. To quote someone in the industry, it's sort of the perception of reality that really matters here, and it's something that NVIDIA doesn't consider at all, or does, but it's using it in ways that aren't great, or don't feel great. If NVIDIA wants to establish a reality where an 80 class card is half of a 90 class card, they can do that. However, if the end user perceives that a 5080 should be a true high-end device, that's all that really matters in terms of public reception. NVIDIA is also responsible for this. The company spent a decade establishing the 80 class cards as top of the line, behind only the Ti class cards. It has now bifurcated those two lines and created a large gulf in between them. And this is getting worse with the 50 series, but especially the 5070s. When you look at that config layout, it starts to look an awful lot like a 50 class card, despite being called 70 and costing $550. That's the kind of crazy part here with the shift. And so while the name itself is technically arbitrary as compared to a hard spec, it still matters because it defines the expectation. This is kind of like a soft topic, though. It's more thinking about and philosophizing about things. And to an extent, none of that really matters. What matters is those two charts we looked at earlier, which are crazy. But let's just explore the philosophy a little more. If Toyota suddenly starts shipping rebadged, I don't know, Yugos and calls it a Camry, that's going to cause problems with the customer base. That's what NVIDIA is doing. If AMC's Gremlin is sold under literally any other name, it's going to cause a problem. The point is, the 5080 is a Yugo, or a Gremlin, or a Ford Pinto, except NVIDIA has spent a decade calling it a supercar. And it was at one point a supercar. Zooming back out, looking at what's actually going on right now, there's no real control here from the user base other than to not buy things you don't want to buy. But we're in the back of the Uber right now, and the Uber has no drive. It's being driven by AI. AI Jensen is driving the Uber at the moment, and the doors are locked. That's where we are. And zooming back out for that picture, and it's downsized them in terms of relative configuration compared to each generation's flagship. All of the lines go down. That chart from earlier, we'll show it again now, it's a lot of words in that section to say one thing, which is line go down equals bad. We don't want line go down. We want line stay same or line go up. Line go up, good. Line go down bad. The 80 class is now in line with the former 70 class, and the 70 Ti or Super class is now in line with 60 Ti class territory. The last 60 class card was configured like a 50 class of yore. Some might argue that the 4090 and 5090 being such monsters skews the comparisons, but we think that's more of a perception issue based on NVIDIA's success at pushing the cost of the high end even higher. NVIDIA's flagship GPUs have been very large pieces of silicon since the 20 series. And the CUDA config cutting had barely begun at that point. And the MSRP wasn't as high as it is now. The price of NVIDIA's GPUs has generally gone up over time, even accounting for inflation that does things like turn the former $700 1080 Ti into a $912 GPU in today's money. But then you look at $900 GPUs in today's money, and that's a 9070 XT. Although to be fair, this example has waifus on it, but it's still a 9070 XT. And I think all of us can agree, even the biggest AMD fans out there, that a 9070 XT, it doesn't feel like a 1080 Ti in terms of the positioning, but they cost about the same in today's money. Although one does have waifus on it. And the 9070 XT is supposed to be $600, but that's not what it is right now. So let's kick that comparison aside, since it's supposed to be closer to $600 to $700. The closest thing might be a 5080 at $1,000, and that too doesn't feel like a 1080 Ti by price. The flagships, though, have gotten the worst, rising from that level to $2,000 with the 5090. Non-flagships haven't risen quite as much, but it's still significant. And in that case, line go up equals bad. I mean, not for the shareholders, but for everyone else. Now, the 70 series here today is one of the most textbook examples of shrinkflation. While the price point has stayed fairly consistent for a few generations, remember that the relative CUDA core configuration has dropped by a huge amount during that time. It's gone from $610 with a 56% configuration in the 30 series down to $550 with an embarrassing 28% core config in the 50 series. So in this example, NVIDIA is giving you a half-size slice of GPU pie with the 5070 than it did with the 3070, but it's charging you about the same modern money. All of the GPUs are a victim to this configuration cutting that we've been talking about. Even the technically cheaper than they used to be 70 and 60 class cards are providing less of a share of capabilities than the respective flagships than they had in the past. And AMD isn't immune to this either, of course. We have a 42-minute video talking about AMD's part in all of this. It's called Fake MSRP. You should check that out separately for our discussion on them. NVIDIA, however, is unique here because it holds 90% of the market. And it's important for you to understand how your money is disproportionately losing value for some of these things as compared to the past, especially when spent with NVIDIA now versus years ago. Now, once again, we don't have an answer for this. This is sort of, it's too big. But it's important to know about, start thinking about it, And who knows, maybe enough people pay attention to this sort of stuff where I guess our end goal is for however many people watch this particular video, it helps with making purchasing decisions and just thinking through like, all right, so I was used to getting a 70 class card. What does that really mean today when I'm buying 70? And to what extent might I be getting ripped off, especially at these not even MSRP prices when it is a $900 waifu video card. But once again, it does come with a waifu backplate. And that value is apparently immeasurable, or $150, I guess. No, wait, it's more than that. It's actually like $300. Oh my God, that's an expensive backplate. Anyway, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Go to store.gamersaccess.net to grab some of our mod mats, project and soldering mats, our t-shirts and other items to help support us. And check out our other videos on these topics like the fake MSRP one, and of course all of our reviews. But that's it for this one. Thanks for watching and subscribe for more. See you all next time.